Okay. I see. We're not discussing it. Okay. Okay. This is the long pause.
Well, good evening. This is the beginning of the program for July of the ACM BayChi, and it's the ongoing Zoom version. I'm sorry, we often meet at Xerox PARC or other interesting places with other user interface research teams within Silicon Valley, but for now we're enjoying no commute. Tonight we're going to enjoy artifacts from the future. Impossible time travel on design. Leo Frishberg is going to join us. He's in Portland at the moment, and it's going to go till approximately 9 o'clock. Let's see. Oh no, I'm there. We are ACM SIG-Chi chapter called BayChi, and you know, ACM is a huge organization. SIG-Chi is actually the second biggest part of SIG-Chi, of ACM. We historically have often been one of the biggest parts, local chapters of SIG-Chi. But in fact, BayChi is not the only group that meets talking about computer-human interface under SIG, under ACM. There are ones in many other parts of the world. And we do have a newsletter and we have monthly meetings, as you're noticing tonight. We also have on our website some other hopefully useful things like, you know, a job bank and consulting. You can put your consulting description up, things like that. We hope you join. It's kind of $20 a month. I want you to point to the BayChi YouTube channel to see at least 30 new videos that have been posted in the last month that are old BayChi talks that, gosh, what's exciting is put them up and many of them have gotten over 100 views just in the last month. That's kind of fun. We love to have people help, and you can volunteer. I call them people that volunteer, experience makers. The most important thing, which I think this has been changed. I wanted to point out that we are looking for a treasurer, and that the treasurer is actually a BayChi officer, and they keep track of gifts, memberships, revenues, and expenses. We have a lot of other things one could do. Some of them take, you know, an hour a month. Some of them take as much time as you have, but it'd be really fun for you to join our group meetings on Thursdays, first of the month at 7:30 that are open to everyone to talk about who is BayChi and how are we becoming what we are and will become. And on the fourth Tuesday of the month, Edwin runs a Birds of a Feather on careers in computer interface. That's probably one thing you might be interested in trying. Other than that, I want to just say thank you for coming and turn it over to Nancy to introduce the speaker.
Thanks, Ted. So I'm delighted tonight to introduce my younger brother, Leo Frishberg, who is the director of UX at athenahealth, and who's going to share with us his ideas about artifacts from the future and the impact of time travel on design. I find this idea very intriguing, and I hope the rest of you will too. Leo started life at a young age, and he has written this delightful book this delightful weighty book, which was published by Morgan Kaufman a few years back, called Presumptive Design. And I suspect that in the course of this evening's discussion, some of the principles of presumptive design and the contrasts between it and some other familiar design thinking or innovation techniques may come up. I don't think I need to go on anymore at all. Leo, take it away.
Great, thank you.
Let me first say, if you'd like, you can stop your video and I will spotlight Leo for all of us. How about that?
And I can't share until this share is complete. So whoever is sharing needs to stop before I can share.
Ta-da!
Here I am. All right, so let's see if I can share now. I can. This is so exciting. All righty, let's do this. And let's do this.
All right, this is an oldie, but well, it's an oldie where I come from. I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
So thank you, Nancy, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity and the honor to contribute to the July Beikai programming event. I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking about myself. You can look on the interwebs to learn more about me, and maybe later in the evening, if you have specific questions, happy to answer those. Instead, I'm going to go right into the discussion this evening, or I should say the talk. Leave the discussion towards the end. I want to offer 3 takeaways from this evening's talk. The first is that as designers, we're unusually positioned to envision the future. But the problem is that our vision is often blurry. The second point, as these quotes suggest, is that the future is slippery, and it's best not to try and predict it. So my talk today is not going to be about future technologies or the future of design or any of those sorts of notions. Instead, I'm going to offer you a fantastical yet simple and practical approach to inventing the future. And the hope is that with this new competency, you'll be able to invent all sorts of futures that your clients and your stakeholders are expecting you to invent. About 40 years ago, I was at a family dinner, and I was sitting next to our great Uncle Abe, who we called Grandpa Abe. It must have been around 1982. He was 95 at the time, and he turned to me and he asked, "Do you think I should buy an IBM PC?" And I was delighted that he should even know what an IBM PC was, let alone consider owning one. And because I was in the business of selling computers at that point in my career, I engaged him in the usual conversation about why he might want one. And we went back and forth, and eventually we decided that at his stage in life, he probably didn't really need a power tool like the IBM PC. So conversation moved on to other technologies that he'd experienced over the course of his 95 years. He went on to live well beyond 100. Grandpa Abe was a haberdasher. He sold women's and men's clothing accessories. And he was based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was his range. He traveled from St. Paul up to Fargo, northwest, across the plains of the upper Midwest. And he did that by horse and buggy. So at that dinner, he said that the biggest impact on his life technologically was the invention of the Model T Ford. So you got to remember, right? This guy saw a whole bunch of things over the course of his century of living, like airplanes, cinema, blenders. He saw just an amazing amount of technology. But the Model T, he said, was the biggest technological impact on his life because it extended his sales range by 2 months. 2 months. That's how he put it. Now, he couldn't see any reason to go further north or west than Fargo, North Dakota. There was really nothing to sell for a haberdasher to sell in that part of the country in 1912. So what that meant was, in that part of the country in 1912, and perhaps still today, you couldn't really take a horse and buggy out before May. He couldn't really leave St. Paul much before May because there was still quite a bit of snow on the ground. And he had to leave Fargo by September so that he wasn't caught by a blizzard in the middle of the plains. And what the Model T allowed him to do is leave St. Paul a little bit early, perhaps wend his way a little bit broader on his path, spend a little more time on the road, and hang out in Fargo a little longer. So I thought that was a pretty cool story. I thought that was a really interesting perspective on the Model T, or on his perception about technology. And then he went on to say, the standard maintenance on the Model T was that every 20 miles, you had to take the head cover off and scrape carbon off the pistons. And I thought my Pinto was bad. And I thought the IBM PC was bad in terms of maintenance. And so I commented to him that I was amazed that anybody would put up with that kind of maintenance. And he said, oh, compared to a horse, that was nothing. So I tell you that story for several reasons. One, I like it. It's nice to tell stories about our ancestors. At least I like to tell stories about my ancestors. And this one happens to be a true story. So I like to tell true stories. It's also really easy to tell stories about technology that's already happened, which, as I say that out loud, it sounds kind of stupid, but it's true, right? We know a lot about the Model T. We know about Ford's manufacturing practices. We know about his supply chain. We know about the sales figures. We've got news articles. We've got eyewitness accounts, right? So we have all this documentation about that technology. So it's pretty easy to tell true stories about technology that's already happened. And the third reason that I tell you that story is that if you were riding beside Grandpa Abe in his Model T back in 1912, neither of you could ever have predicted the impact of that technology on our economy, our culture, or our environment. So let me focus on a particular aspect of that story. It's easy for us to talk about the past and about past technology. Why can't we talk about the future and about future technology with the same ease? A key point of my talk today returns to that theme, which is, as designers, we are required to talk about the future with our stakeholders, but our tools for enabling those conversations and the language that we have often fail us. So that was a quick story about a past technology, one that has had significant impact on our lives. Let's keep going. Let's roll forward to 1983 and another technology that's had a pretty significant impact on our lives, high performance computing. So now it's 1983, right about the time that I'm having this conversation with Grandpa Abe. And Moore's Law has been around for almost 20 years, right? And for those of you unfamiliar, Moore's Law is the doubling of silicon gates roughly every 18 to 24 months. So this has been going on for 20 years already. And so there in that lower left corner in that sort of blue postage stamp figure is the IBM PC with its 8088 microprocessor. And that little red postage stamp right above it is the Cray XMP, which in 1983 was the fastest supercomputer on the planet. Now, everybody knew back then that today we would have access to supercomputers, hundreds, if not thousands of times more powerful than the Cray, because that was math, right? That was just extending Moore's Law forward. And so what you see in those little dotted diamonds are various devices that were brought to market over the course of time. So that really wasn't a prediction. That was simply extending a formula into the future. But again, in 1983, nobody could have predicted the impact of this set of supercomputers that we're holding in our hands on our environment, our economy, or our culture. In fact, nobody talked about us holding them in our hands at all in 1983. So I submit that it's a fool's errand to try and predict the future. But again, back to the first point, it's easy to talk about technology of the past or even of the present. What can we do to talk about technology of the future? If as designers, we're expected to invent the future, shouldn't we be equipped with the language to talk about it? So tonight, I'm going to propose an approach to reliably inventing the future, and it's composed of 3 parts. The first part is a perspective about the future. The second is an artifact. And the third is a way of engaging your users with that artifact. When you've put all 3 together, you'll be surprised to see that you're actually working with artifacts from the future. So let's start with that first component of this approach, a perspective about the future. As designers, I claim, we all have a superpower. And for those of you who may have heard me confess this before, I discovered I had this superpower years ago. I was at one of those workshops and they said, hey, write down one of your superpowers. And it came to me. I realized that I had this superpower. I can see the future. And over the years, I've enjoyed that superpower. And then I've come to realize that all designers actually have this superpower. It's really one of the things that we leverage when we help our stakeholders move into an envisioned and hopefully better place. We think about the future, I submit, as a time stream that stretches in front of us, as a road. It's a spatial sort of analogy. And whether you're an interaction designer thinking about the next 5 seconds and the next 5 seconds after that and the next 5 seconds after that, or you are trying to create a new society in which you have to design a constitution to last centuries, we need to project ourselves down that road. And that projection, which we do as designers, it turns out, is not peculiar to designers. Almost all of us plan for the future. We wouldn't be able to make dinner or figure out what to wear if we couldn't think a few hours ahead. So it's not that we as designers have this superpower. It's just that we get paid for it, hopefully. And so there's a higher expectation and a higher bar for us than for the rest of the folks. So before we get all proud about this superpower and rest on these laurels, we have to admit that as with most superpowers, it comes with a super flaw. And at least from me, in spite of my incredible ability to see the future, I'm always wrong. And what's even more challenging is that I'm wrong in 2 ways. I'm wrong in the amount of wrongness, the degree of wrongness, and I'm wrong in terms of the types of things I'm wrong about. So it's terrible. It's a terrible superpower, right? But I suspect that that flaw is true for all designers. We see the future, and we're wrong in so many ways. So that's a conundrum. If we're expected to predict the future or invent the future or envision the future, and we're pretty good about it, we're pretty good at it, maybe we're better than the average individual, we're also probably wrong. So I'm going to help solve that conundrum for us this evening. And the first step is to start thinking about the future in a different way. What if instead of trying to talk about the future as if it was someplace down this road, we talked about it as if it had already happened? What if we took that Gibson quote a little more seriously? That instead of inventing a future, we actually believed it was already here. If we could convince ourselves that the future was already here, then our work shifts from imagining a future to simply finding it. It turns into a scavenger hunt. What if we had our own private Model T TARDIS and could transport ourselves down that time stream, pick up a solution, bring it back to our clients to show them what's in store for them? So for this technique that I'm going to offer to you in a few moments, for that to work, we have to shift our perspective about the future. You're already standing down that time stream, and you're just looking at your feet and picking up the thing that's there. Now, as far-fetched as that might sound, turns out that it's not that unusual a point of view. I'm certainly not the first to propose this notion of bringing the future forward. The idea has been around probably for centuries, but certainly has been studied significantly for the last 50 years. And there's quite a bit of continuing interest in the idea. If you were to do a quick search of the interwebs for artifacts from the future, please do that after the talk. You'll see results from a variety of institutes that promote this notion. So I'm going to give you a very short course on some of the background that got us to this idea of artifacts future and designers in their approach to inventing the future. So I go back to the mid-1960s. The Imperial College in London has developed one of the first academic curriculum associated with design research. Their intention was to understand better how designers think, because they had identified design thinking as one of the crucial elements of envisioning the future. The term design research has changed a lot over the last 50 years. Most recently, it now means using the artifacts of design to help drive research. And it still includes, of course, this notion of how do designers think, but now it's often used as design as an approach to doing discovery. So in this most recent definition of design research, we engage with all sorts of people, with all sorts of artifacts to provoke, inspire, understand, reflect, in service of better understanding the future. And there's lots of ways and lots of artifacts that help drive research. So I'm not going to spend much time on these because for the most part, these aren't artifacts from the future. But I bring this up to underscore the point that designers really are engaged in inventing the future. And there's a bunch of different techniques that we have available to us to do that. This particular landscape of design research approaches is being used by permission from Liz Sanders and B.J. Stapper's fantastic book about participatory design from 2013, The Convivial Toolbox. So all of these methods here use artifacts in some way to glean insights and to provoke conversation. But again, none of these are artifacts in the future. For that, let me go back to the 60s again. Roughly about the same time that the Imperial College was embarking on their curriculum, also coming out of England, out of London, was the neo-futurist architectural movement. And which was a highly sort of conceptual approach to architecture. And it was based on this premise of crafting artifacts from the future. And these artifacts were actually designed in service of reflecting on the cultural values and norms of the time. So here you see an offering by one of the leading neo-futurist studios, Archigram. And in this provocation, Ron Heron, one of the partners of the firm, details a radical idea: walking cities. So in this walking cities glimpse of the future that was presented within a museum context, Archigram describes an army of robotic cities that travel across the countryside, stopping every once in a while near a village, hanging out for a bit, and then getting up and leaving. And when they leave, they deposit a cluster of high-tech conductivity and networking technology in their wake. This is the mid-1960s. This is before ARPANET. This is crazy talk. If we were going to grade Archigram on the accuracy of their prediction, I think we'd agree that they got almost everything wrong. Well, at least by today's standard. Maybe it's still coming. But they weren't predicting the future. They were crafting artifacts to drive conversations about the future. What does it mean to live in a city? What does it mean? What is all this motion about? What are we moving around all the time? What is connectivity all about? Why do we want to stay connected to people? Through their particularly whimsical approach, they were able to drive a lot of interesting conversations. But other neo-futurists weren't nearly as lighthearted. Also, another neo-futurist group at the time, this one is Super Studio, coming out of Milan, were far less optimistic. In this provocation, they were exploring what it would mean to extend the notion of consumption and production to some absurd convergence way in the future. What would we become if we continued to increase our consumption? Super consumption, super production, super. And I remember seeing this exhibit, and one of the images that I recall was maybe a meter by meter square room, a line drawing of the square of this sort of meter cube with a sole occupant who was folded over on themselves. And all of the occupants' needs were provided for in that one room. Super Studio's dystopic visions were a logical sort of extension of a lot of the cultural trends that they were observing. So these firms and many of the others presented futures as if they had already happened. These were not polite white papers or reasonable deductions built on, incrementally logical, stepwise arguments. No, these were snapshots of a future presented as fait accompli. These creators brought artifacts back from the future for the sole purpose of driving important conversations about our culture, our values, and where our current perspectives might be leading us. And for some of you, that may be familiar territory because the roots of speculative design start with the neo-futurist movement. And here we have Dunn and Raby's book, Speculative Everything, which is, again, about speculative design, an approach to future artifacting that is essentially an extension of the neo-futurist notion. The point of these design fictions is to take our current assumptions about the way the world works, tear them apart, highlight a few, throw some away, but extend something into some absurd, distant reality, distant future, to give us a spyglass into what our culture might become. And they're presented as museum exhibits, similarly to the neo-futurist group. These artifacts, these speculative designs, they're just amazing. They're high fidelity, they're beautifully crafted, and as a result, they're extremely compelling. But they're at the same time incredibly disturbing. Speculative designs are essentially, like the neo-futurists, very intentional in punching us in the throat. They ask whether the values that we hold dear today are truly worth preserving if they should lead to such artifacts. If these objects really existed in the future, what do they say about the folks who invested in them, who allowed them to emerge, who may in fact celebrate them? Who are those people? And if they're a lot like us, who are we? On the right, we have Emmy Hacker's speculative design for her master's thesis, slated for the year 2050. That's 250. Jogos, which she describes as a wearable that makes its users elite athletes. Jogos technology makes the average Joe into a pro, quote unquote. As part of her website, she provides a backstory for the creation of Jogos along with all of her marketing materials. Again, it already exists. She's bringing it to us from the future. And again, she's bringing it to our attention, not because she expects us to build these things or to wonder how to build them better, but to ask us these pointed questions about our current culture's obsession with enhancement and elite athleticism and body augmentation. So artifacts in this domain are assumed to already exist in some distant future. They are used to provoke discussion about that future, a future we may not actually want, but is potentially an extension of our present. And for the final sort of backdrop, literally, of these artifacts from the future, the vast realm that the film industry has been bringing to us for over a century. I'm thinking of Fritz Lang's Metropolis as a wonderful rendition of a future, which we still haven't achieved. Well, maybe we have in some ways. Dr. David Kirby refers to these specific kinds of artifacts as diegetic prototypes. And Nathan Shedroff and Christopher Nosel's excellent book, Make It So, describes all sorts of future technologies that have been envisioned by Hollywood. And while these are primarily designed to entertain, they're also immersive. They create the environment within which the action unfolds and in which the narrative occupies. Kirby suggests that diegetic prototyping is the means by which audiences come to accept these technologies, because they are part of the backdrop that enables the plot. In diegetic prototypes, designers are not creating artifacts in service of learning about the future, or maybe not even for provoking discussion about a potentially dystopic future. Sometimes I'm sure back in the production room, they're arguing about whether they should make something more or less disturbing. But the primary purpose of these artifacts from the future are to persuade as well as to entertain. So diegetic prototypes are tools of persuasion and conditioning, right? They're an attempt to move us into a different perspective. Now, as a sidebar, one of the ironies is that current day engineers and designers are often inspired by the visions that they've seen in these futuristic films. So they go ahead and they build those technologies, which naturally leads us back to the future. And the Nike Mag, first proposed in the film as a diegetic prototype, but released just a couple of years ago as Adapt, a self-lacing tennis shoe. And so this is just one example of many recent technology introductions that were inspired by these diegetic prototypes. So all of that is to help. Thanks, Siri. All of that is to help you understand the various ways in which design and the offering of artifacts have been used to envision, educate, and explore the future. But as I suggested at the top, I'm offering you something quite different. I'm offering you a way of working with actual artifacts from the future as a means of improving the reliability of your designs and your ability to invent the futures that you've been hired to invent. So when you hear me talk about artifacts from the future the way I've been insisting, maybe it starts to sound a little silly or worse. But I say that's because we don't really have the language or even the verb tenses in English, at least as far as I know, to talk about things that show up today in the here and now, but actually their origins are in the future. So without that language to help us, I think we're going to be hard pressed to shift our perspectives about the future, or even to use artifacts that come from the future. Remember, in this approach that I'm going to be giving you shortly, it has three parts. First of all, I have to change our perspective about the future. There's this artifact, and then there's this way of engaging your users with that artifact. So to truly believe that we are working with artifacts from the future, I found it helps to use a special vocabulary reserved just for such things. And as it turns out, I had to invent a word, since design fictions and diegetic prototypes already mean something very different from what I'm describing. So this new word sounds a lot like a word that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with, and that's anachronism, right? An anachronism is an error. It's about a thing or an object or a phrase or something that has shown up out of time. Usually it is an object that in film or in literature has no right to be in that scene because it hasn't been invented yet. As an example, consider when I was talking a few moments ago about the architectural studio Archigram and how they were building on the cultural norms of the mid-1960s. If I had said cultural memes of the 1960s, I would have introduced an anachronism because the word meme didn't exist until Dawkins introduced it in 1976. So we're pretty familiar with anachronism, but my word is a little different. It's called Bidochronism. Bidochronism is an artifact from the future. Bidochronology is the study of those artifacts, or it's the practice of using those artifacts. I want you to think about bidochronology as future archaeology. It turns out these artifacts from the future, these bidochronisms, they have some pretty peculiar properties that when they get put together, makes them very odd, very elusive, and very difficult to manage. But once you understand their characteristics and you learn to master them, bidochronisms become a massively useful tool for improving the odds of inventing the future that you've been hired to invent. So there's three principles. The first one is that bidochronisms are ambiguous. They're unstable, actually. They shift shape. They're constantly changing. Even as you look at them in one moment and you blink, they change. Now, you maybe can't imagine how an object could do that, but we see objects like this all the time. In this case, these optical illusions, as you stare at them, they come in and out of the page, or foreground and background shift. So much like these, bidochronisms shift as we shift our perspective and look at them from different angles. We also have to think about bidochronisms through the lens of the culture from whence they came. We know they must be potent in meaning because they were created. Somebody created them. They had to have a reason to create them. But we can't think about them through our cultural frame. We have to think about them through the cultural frame of the future culture. Pardon me. And again, we're perfectly fine with artifacts that come from the past that require cultural interpretation, right? Are these offerings? Are they funerary urns? Are they modes of transaction? Are they dinner plates? We can't really tell what these are. And when we visit a museum of antiquities, we don't question that these ancient discs of metal or scraps of clay actually existed, right? We know that. We know they exist. We can see them. Instead, we wonder, what is their significance? And even more interestingly, what was their significance to that culture? Which gives us a window into some potentially very different ways of navigating the world. So only by studying the cultural contexts of these objects do we actually begin to understand their significance. And the last strange property of bidochronisms is that time travel transforms them pretty badly. When we look at something like this, which could become an bidochronism, we're not sure if it's a button, if it's a handle, if it's a lever. We're not exactly sure. The form is not a reliable indicator about the function or the feature. But again, they existed in the future. There must have been a good reason for them to show up in the future. So that reason and the meaning behind them and the value that they brought to that future culture is here. That didn't get lost. Conceptually, like, consider that in the future, we have this wonderfully shiny, bright new object. But as it gets brought back to us, it degrades. Time travel corrodes it. Parts fall off. Stuff transform until really these things arrive with very poor fidelity and ambiguous features. We don't really know what they are. But we can be confident that they were created in a future of time, and that even though they lost their form, they keep that meaning, they keep that reason for having been created. And the challenge for us is to actually understand what that meaning is, and what it meant to that culture in the future. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you this technique just in a minute or so. It comprises 3 components: a perspective about the future. It's not far away, it's not down the road, it's already here. It involves this artifact, this odd idochronistic artifact, and it involves a way of engaging with your users with that artifact. So I keep saying, if the future's already here and it's a scavenger hunt, then we should just be able to look around and find these artifacts all around us, because we don't actually have a TARDIS. At least I don't. And if you do, please invite me. But I keep saying it's a scavenger hunt. The future's already here. So where are all of these artifacts that are supposedly lying around? Okay, so as designers, remember, we're hired to invent the future. And because we're designers, we've probably practiced and mastered an awful lot of techniques and have these tools and skills to try and tease that future out. And in fact, we create artifacts all the time as part of our design process and our design thinking process. So what if I was to say to you that you actually hold the future literally in your hands, in your sketchbooks, on your whiteboards, on your murals, and in your studios? What if the sketches in your journals and whiteboards were your diary of your trips through time? What if your sketchbook was a time traveler's journal? I submit that our sketches are glimmers and glimpses into a multitude of futures. Futures we have the obligation to create because we've been hired by our stakeholders to do that. But these sketches aren't resolved enough for us to have much confidence. And we can't really predict the future based on them. How do we figure out which future they're from? We can't tell by inspection what they mean. They're degraded, they're ambiguous. They also mean something to us because we designed them, or we've sketched them. But what do they actually mean to the denizens of the future? So our sketches are the basis for Bidochronisms. They're the basis, but not quite yet Bidochronisms. For that, we need these other 2 ingredients. We need a belief that these are really from the future. It's that perspective shift. The future's already here. And we need a particular way of engaging our users with them. So I say that the artifact is one of the easiest things of this technique, because we're constantly creating them anyway. But it turns out the entire approach is a little tricky. When Marty McFly goes into his rendition of Chuck Berry's classic, he almost created an Bidochronism. This is an oldie, he says, introducing the song, because for him, it had been around his entire life. But then he recognizes his mistake and he backpedals. And then he realizes that the song is actually contemporaneous to his audience, or will be, only to discover that in a panic, his embellishments were truly artifacts from their future his present. Up until the partygoers heard his notes, they were just an improv doodle in his repertoire. But as soon as those notes hit the audience's ears, those riffs could have become an Bidochronism. A key ingredient to transforming our sketches into Bidochronisms is to have an audience. Without an audience, they're just sketches. But there's more. It's not just any audience. For a sketch to become an Bidochronism, your audience must be folks a lot like the folks who are engaging with that artifact in the future. So Marty offers his riffs to the audience, who are in many ways much like his peers, which he acknowledges at the end of the scene. Your kids are going to love it. But the problem is he didn't plan on offering this artifact. He didn't have a clue what he was going to do or where it was going to lead. So he had 2.5 of the 3 ingredients that he needed to make these riffs into an Bidochronism. He had the riffs, and he had a perspective about the future. It was already here. And he had an audience. But what he failed to have was the disciplined approach to engaging that audience. So artifacts don't just magically transform into Bidochronisms on their own, even if you put them in front of other people. In most cases, they'll just lie there. And in the worst case, they won't even be noticed. So let me summarize. To turn your sketches into Bidochronisms, you need 3 ingredients. You need a sketch. You need a specific state of mind about the future. And you need an intentional approach to engaging with your users. So we got the sketches, right? Those are easy. They're lying around all over the place. For a state of mind, we truly have to believe that these things really are from the future. Rather than thinking about the future as some far-off territory, we have to shift our perspective. Along the lines of that William Gibson quote, the future's already here. We just don't necessarily understand it. So rather than talk about the future as what if, we have to think about the future as what is. And similar, I guess, to speculative design or diegetic prototypes, Bidochronology asks us to believe we are literally handling an artifact from the future. And that 3rd ingredient for these artifacts, these glimmers of the future, to become Bidochronisms, we have to have our users engage with them. For the Bidochronism to emerge, real people must attempt to use these sketches as if they were for real, because they are for real. They're just not in our space-time continuum. So again, in a nutshell, Bidochronisms emerge when we ask our users to engage with our design sketches as if those sketches are actually from the future. And along with that magical transformation, we enjoy the benefits of understanding the meaning behind those artifacts and the reasons that they were built in that future. And that's the key distinction between Bidochronisms and these other sorts of design fictions that I talked about earlier. Diegetic prototypes and speculative designs, for example, people engage with those passively. They look at them in a museum or they see them on the wall. And as a result, those artifacts fail to reveal their meaning behind their existence. In many ways, the meaning is given to us. It's actually written out as part of the captions for these designs. But when we ask our users to engage with our sketches as if they are truly artifacts from the future, those sketches, they tell us about that future with a clarity that none of these other techniques offers. So remember, this major flaw, the super flaw that we have as designers is that we get our future, and we see the future and we get it wrong. Our vision might be blurry. Bidochronisms help wipe the crystal ball clean. They reveal ways that we get things wrong and the degrees to which we get them wrong. Through these user engagements with our design sketches, our musings about the future are suddenly informed by the people who expect to be served by those designs. And the information that they give us is all about what that sketch means to them, what its significance is to them. And in turn, it enriches our degraded understanding of that future design. Because really, think about it, by the time our design is actually out in the field, it's going to be sometime in the future. And its form at that point will be imbued with the meanings that we've uncovered today. So, as Nancy foretold a little bit, telegraphed, many of you may recognize this process that Charles Lambdin and I documented in our book, Presumptive Design, even though we hadn't really named the artifacts Bidochronisms. But Bidochronisms are really the core of the presumptive design process. I want to share with you the first time that I encountered Bidochronology officially, formally. It was during a mini conference that Nancy and I developed back in 2004 in Vienna. And the Bidochronology part of it was a spectacular failure. The conference went very well. We had invited 40 designers of all stripes from all over the world to work together over 2 very intense days in service of understanding what the commonalities were amongst our design disciplines. And the target of our effort was a pretty nasty problem, which remains pretty nasty today, and that is medication errors in the elderly, mitigating medication errors for the elderly. So this concept by Vincent Berkeley Chen was not part of the conference. This was a much more recent concept. It may have come out somewhere like 2014. But for the sake of discussion, this very much looks like what I was seeing these teams attempting to craft back in 2004 during this workshop. So let me set the scene. You've got these 40 eager designers of all stripes, industrial, interaction, experience, you name it. And you've got a handful of design researchers, usability folks, ethnographers. And you've got 10 elders, all women, all over the age of 75. And we're about to visit them in their assisted living community room. And they're there to help us understand the challenges that they face in managing their meds. And this is what we offered them. I think you can begin to see much of Chen's concept emerging here. These are just a couple of examples, but if I was to show you all the photographs, you would certainly see aspects of Chen's concept rendered here. And principle 3 of the Bidochronism appears in force here. Pill time, Chen's concept, surely has come back from 2014 to 2004, looking pretty different from its slick imagery. But sad to say, these artifacts never transformed into Bidochronisms. And it was our fault, right? We didn't really give them a chance. And we failed on 2 fronts. We didn't really embrace this perspective that we were working with artifacts from the future. And we did not approach the engagement with these elders in a way that would allow these Bidochronisms to appear. Now, in our defense, I've never worked with more intimidating group of people than 80-year-old women. They have not much time left on the planet, and these particular women did not suffer fools gladly. So it was a pretty difficult, there was some language barriers. There were a number of reasons that we were coming in a bit tentative. But one of the things that I have to say is that those women, it wasn't that they didn't take us seriously when we showed up with these sketches. Actually, on the contrary, we didn't take ourselves seriously. We chickened out. When we showed them these things and they initially sort of rejected them, we didn't actually continue to create this reality distortion field. We backed off. We didn't believe we were working with artifacts that came from the future. And so the spell was never really cast. The women ignored the artifacts as bits of paper and glue and thought we were a little nutsy. But they were really engaged with the process. And as a result, they started pulling out their own medical management devices and dispensaries. And it became a much more typical ethnographic show and tell sort of thing, which was great, right? Ended up being fantastic. So some of you who may have participated in presumptive design workshops certainly recognize these artifacts that are degraded by their travel through time. But Bidochronisms don't have to be objects at all. Again, I refer back to Marty McFly and his rock licks that he appropriated from Chuck Berry, right? It's just sound. It doesn't have to be a physical object. In this case, my team at Intel was approached by an internal client asking us to figure out if a, quote, discrete collaborative toolkit employees could snap together would be worth purchasing and putting out into the enterprise. And the wonderful thing about this Bidochronism was that it only took a few minutes to build. It only took a few hours to bring out into the field, and it only took a couple of days from start to finish to get the results back to our stakeholders as to what we had learned. And all the participants who worked with these objects took us seriously. More importantly, they engaged with the eggs exactly as they imagined they would engage with this system in the future. And they naturally talked about and told stories about their expectations for what the system was supposed to do. And through that engagement, the eggs, the carton, and some paper plates that also happen to be part of this suddenly transformed into this magical Bidochronism as they demonstrated how that experience was going to work for them. These people's expectations for the system identified requirements that none of us had understood, imagined, or predicted. This Bidochronism was a paltry shadow of that system. It's just not even like, what? It's a set of plastic Easter eggs with some labels on it. How could this possibly be even close to what this enterprise system was going to be, right? But irrespective of that lack of form and fidelity, the user's engagement with these objects was fundamental to our understanding of what that future experience needed to be. Now, as I kind of bring this to a close, lest you think that Bidochronisms are a form of prototyping, let me assure you that they are not. Prototypes assist us in finding a solution to a putative problem. Bidochronisms relieve us of all of that hard work because the solution already exists. What we're trying to figure out is what the problem is going to be. What is the problem that's so compelling that in the future, this thing got created? Why did we solve that problem in the future? What was that about? Bidochronisms aren't meant to work. They're not even supposed to make believe that they work, where prototypes are often highly representative simulations of some kind of functionality. Prototypes necessarily represent the final thing. They express attributes of an ultimate object or a system. Bidochronisms don't represent anything. They are the thing, although they're impoverished and degraded. And so prototypes differ from Bidochronisms in another kind of important way. In this classic scene from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, Alice is admonished by the Red Queen for not running fast enough. And yet we face a similar challenge when we're doing rapid prototyping. It's very much like running the Red Queen's race, in which we have to run as fast as we can, but we end up staying in the same place. Because prototyping is in the solutions phase. And we have a development team that's putting a lot of pressure on us to get us the answer that they need in order to build it. But we know that the best way to figure out a better solution is to iterate on our prototypes and keep getting out into the field as we get more and more honed. But that takes time, and it's time we don't have. So it's a pretty classic Red Queen race where we're running as fast as we can in order to stay in the same place. But Bidochronisms, they take a page from the White Queen's notebook. Carroll's White Queen lives backwards. She's already experienced the real thing. Bidochronisms presume you start with something that already exists, the what is. If it already exists, then there must have been good reason for it. Now, while you suspect what those reasons are because you sketched the thing, so you probably have a good idea of what you were sketching, right? You also have a whole lot of questions about it. At least, I hope you do, because remember, our superpower has this super flaw, right? We're always wrong. But by engaging your users with these special kinds of artifacts, by transforming them into Bidochronisms, you actually get to observe your users' mental states and their mental models. And you get to hear their beliefs about that future. You get to hear what they think it means and what its value is. If we situate it in the UK Design Council's double diamond diagram, and prototyping is clearly on the right diamond, it's about refining the solution. Bidochronisms happen upstream from the decision point. And this is kind of interesting because they already exist, right? They came from the future, they already exist. So you can reach out to them anytime. You don't have to like wait for a decision. You can say, oh, this thing already exists. You can, the way I think about it is you can pull it from a curiosity cabinet of the future, right? Oh, there's a sketch, there's a thing. I wonder what that means, right? And so you can do it pretty early. In fact, Bidochronisms often influence the design brief. They are most crucial in validating the problem that's been given to us by our stakeholders. And as a result, they are also quite helpful in establishing strategy. Because again, we talk about the value of the future. If this strategy already exists in the future and it sort of looks like this, what does it mean? Is it going to be well received? Are people interpreting it with the value that we think it has, or are they bringing something different to the table? So consider, the automobile hasn't changed all that much since 1905. Ford would recognize the DeLorean or the Tesla Model T as an automobile, even if he really didn't understand the form, or maybe the materials, or even the technology stacks. But in spite of it revolutionizing almost everything around us, the artifact itself hasn't changed substantially. And more importantly, the problem and the value and the meaning behind the automobile hasn't changed. It's still attempting to provide personal independence through an individual-based transportation system, along with status. So I say it's a fool's errand to predict the future. Instead, let's use our superpowers and the sketches in our notebooks to create it. Use Bidochronisms to rapidly assess the problem our clients think is important. The process that we discuss in Presumptive Design is pretty straightforward. We discover the future in our sketchbooks, or we create it with our stakeholders. We specifically, actually, in the book, talk about designing these artifacts to make them easy to turn into Bidochronisms, although we don't ever call them Bidochronisms. We ask our clients, users, to engage with those sketches, and through their engagement, transform them into Bidochronisms. And through those users' questions, their comments, their reactions, we actually decipher and tease out the meaning of those artifacts for the future. And we determine the problem that they were intended to solve. And it turns out that problem might be very different from the one that our client asked us to consider when we first crafted the sketch, which is truly a magical thing. So let me leave you with this challenge. Whoops. Sometime in the next few months, take a trip in your Model T TARDIS. Drum up the courage to engage users with your sketches with virtually no refinement. And if you want to learn more about how to make them a little bit more accessible so they become perhaps a little more fluidly into Bidochronisms, see the book. Watch how these sketches transform into Bidochronisms and listen carefully to the meaning that your users ascribe to them. And reach out to me. Tell me your stories. What worked? What'd you learn? If your experiences are anything like mine have been for the last several years, you and your stakeholders will discover amazing things about the future that neither you or they could have ever dreamed of or predicted. And I will take questions, should there be any.
Well, thank you, Leo. And I bet there are going to be questions. I did not see a lot of questions in the chat as we were going along. And so I'm eager for people to raise your hand or speak up, come off mute, and add your questions. And thank you, Lisa, for sharing and also Bill for sharing memories of your relatives, and they're, which I think are very meaningful here in this discussion. Okay. So Leo, I know you've deployed this technique in the real world. Even though we claim we started in 2004, you've done lots of refinement, and writing the book helped you get more clear about that. So talk about that stakeholder engagement a little bit.
Right. So there's two types of stakeholders, right? There's your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. So the presumptive design process involves working with your internal stakeholders through a participatory design engagement. And it's in that participatory design process in which you elicit from your internal stakeholders. Sometimes they are the highest paid people with opinions. Sometimes they actually are SMEs, subject matter experts. But regardless, you're supposedly being asked to invent a future. And as a result, there really is, nobody really knows. It's an unknown unknown, right? By definition, otherwise you wouldn't be in the room. And so what you're helping tease out in these, what we call creation sessions, are sketches. And those sketches embody or make manifest the assumptions that your stakeholders have about the future. Sometimes those assumptions are pretty banal, like it has to have a display. And some of them are quite existential. We're still going to be in business a year from now, right? But irrespective, you try and tease those assumptions out, and you try and tease them out as an artifact. And the job of the design team during this participatory design process is to enable the stakeholders' engagement with getting their assumptions made manifest into an object. And the design problem here is, how do you design this artifact so that it can easily become an Bidochronism? That turns out to be the design problem, which is an unusual design problem, and often takes designers a few cycles to actually understand what the point of all of this is. So that's the creation session, and that's the internal stakeholder engagement. Now, the beautiful thing about this process is you can bring these sketches with very little, like none, polish out into the world to a set of stakeholders who represent the intended users of this future that you've been asked to invent. Sometimes what we do in the workshops is we run these creation sessions, and then we invite the external stakeholders to come in to the workshop and start to work immediately with these artifacts. So there is no waiting, there's no delay, there's no latency. And this is where it gets to be tricky, right? Because it's not a usability study. We're not looking for errors. We're not looking for time on task. We're not looking for their ability to even do anything. What we are asking them to do is use these artifacts to complete a task which we believe they want to do. We think the future that we're inventing involves a set of tasks. It's one of our assumptions. And so we offer them these highly ambiguous artifacts with the ask that they complete one or more tasks. And after a period of cognitive dissonance, which can last perhaps as long as a few minutes, these external stakeholders, these informants, these participants, seeing that we're actually serious or frightened because they see we are living in some bizarre reality, nonetheless, accept the terms of the engagement, and when done correctly, they literally take the artifact in their hands and they start to talk about and demonstrate how they were going to use this artifact to complete the tasks. And when that happens, everything falls away. All the artifice falls away. Suddenly, a googly eye and a pipe cleaner and a scrap of magazine ad no longer look like that to these folks. They are literally engaging with them as if they are displays or buttons or interface elements or whatever. It's pretty fascinating to watch. Did I answer the question?
Yes, I think you answered it enough for now. I'm going to remove the spotlight and invite everybody to be visible. I'll be visible myself. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that again. And please, Bill, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Oh, sure. Why not? I'm not gonna do video. Hey, Leo.
Okay.
Awesome to see you.
Yes, lovely to hear your voice.
So my thing is, actually, I'm currently doing a program right now in Foresight out of Houston, which has been a lot of fun. So this feels very familiar and awesome. So my question for you is, when you're thinking through what the artifact will be, or maybe will have been,
Yes,
I
exactly.
want to play with the tenses. How do you go about choosing which aspects of that are constraints and which are wide open?
Well, it actually is a slightly different question. The question becomes, what level of ambiguity is too much, and what level of ambiguity drives the conversations in a way that is helpful? So it's not really about a solution, right? We're not solving for anything. What we're trying to do is provoke a discussion about the problem. And we're trying to provoke a discussion around the internal stakeholders' assumptions about that problem. So let me give you a quick example. Another example from Intel, working with their futures group, an internal entrepreneurial group. They literally were in the business of creating new markets for chips, not new technologies, not new companies, new entire markets. And they had this idea about how they were going to start driving a new market. And they had a business plan, and they had a whole bunch of decks from all sorts of marketing research people. And they wanted us to build a prototype of how this thing was going to work. That was going to be sort of the trigger for starting this avalanche to create this new market. And I said, why, if you got that much money burning a hole in your pocket, why don't we do a presumptive design and spend it on different part of the process? And so I got them all together, and they sketched out, I don't know, you'd sort of notice it today as an app marketplace, right, essentially. And we didn't actually render it as an app marketplace. We rendered it so it was really pretty fuzzy. It was a rectangle, and it had a series of these weird fuzzed out icons, right? And the second screen that they created was the landing screen that these target users we were going to test this with were going to see when they first opened an app. But the landing screen was really a series of cards, widgets, let's just say, with squiggly lines and Greeked out text. Like, it was absolutely meaningless, right? Except there were certain key elements in some of those cards. There were clearly multiple values. Some of them had XY coordinates, and it was clearly a time series. But the labels and the keys and all of that were, the legends were completely irrelevant. That was it. Those were the two artifacts for a multi-$100 million market plan that Intel was about to explore. I thought that was quite courageous of the internal stakeholders to let us do this. We went out to their target folks. We showed the actual users, the real users in these target locations, not the managers, not the CEOs who had been already shown the decks, but the actual operators and users who would need to actually engage with this concept. And within, I don't know, 3 conversations, the VC looked at me and he went, oh my God, we're thinking too small. Like, this guy already leapfrogged us. He already figured out what we were doing. He jumped ahead 3 years. He rewrote practically most of the business plan as a result of these engagements. So again, it's not about the constraints and it's not about the solution. It's really about, what problem do you think you're actually trying to solve? And do your users agree with you? Or is there a different problem that they have that you may not have been aware of that this teases out? Did that address the question? Maybe you were asking a different question.
No, that was awesome. Thank you.
Ted's had his hand up, waiting eagerly to talk to you,
Yeah.
Leo.
So, I mean, I really see this as a beautiful demonstration of question creation and exploration. And what I'm always concerned about is how do you really test questions? And so I often play around with and wonder when and for who is it valuable to do what level of mock-up, what level of prototype, and what level of evaluation of those.
Yep. So this is a really, presumptive design is actually a kind of a advanced technique. It's kind of frightening, actually. When I do workshops with folks who have a lot of years under their belt and really understand the niceties of user research and appropriate kinds of inquiry, or they have a really beautiful design background, there's sort of two cognitive dissonances that come up. The first one that comes up is, wait, you're actually going to ruin the neutrality of my research by biasing the conversation towards a pre-designed artifact? That sounds like what we're already doing at my office. I'm not interested, right? That's the researcher like attempting to maintain neutrality. And for the designer, it's, I really got to understand what the solution is. And as I've tried to illustrate here, no, that's not exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to design the conversation. So the designer's job is to actually build these artifacts in a way to drive the right conversation. The researcher's job is to accept whatever path the informant takes us down. So we talk about in the book, like these rabbit holes. In a usability test, we don't want to go down rabbit holes. We want to figure out if they stayed on task or if they made errors or how much time they spent or whatever. In presumptive design, we offer this artifact for the sheer joy and purpose of having our informants take us on a journey. And it's a wild journey and it's a wacko journey. And sometimes it goes in places that we just, why are you going here? Why are you spending time talking about the Fribowitz function? Why is that so important to you? We never heard about this thing before. Why is that thing that you want to talk about right now? And so these provocations are specifically designed to get your informants to talk about the stuff that's meaningful to them. So there's very few questions. We really ask, the script is when I talked to Shedroff, and he's in Shedroff about this early on, and he goes, dude, this is like improv. And that's what it is. You're offering, Charles, my co-author, said, look, when you first told me about this thing, you said you could use a baked potato for any presumptive design. It didn't. The artifact itself is you have to give them an artifact. They have to take it from you. They have to own the artifact, but it doesn't have to represent anything. It merely has to be a proxy for whatever their mental model is about the tasks and about the assumptions that you've been pretty transparent about. And when they say, yeah, no, I don't understand at all what you're talking about when you said, assumption X, Y, Z, here's what my real problem is. And I'll show you how that plays out with this artifact. So I don't know if I've really addressed the notion of how do you evaluate, but the evaluation says, look at these stories we heard. When we show these artifacts, the same artifact generally, sometimes we make changes to it, to 6 or 8 or 10 different folks, and we hear the same story every time, that's data. Something's going on there. And it's even better when that story was never heard before. Like nobody had ever heard those stories before. And yet we keep hearing those stories. So now we have to understand what that means. And we have to decide whether that's worth pursuing, right? It's the age-old innovation question. Hey, there's this big, hairy problem out there. We got to go solve it. And everybody goes, yeah, but that's not our problem. We can't make money solving that problem. Nice to know it exists, but That's not our problem, right? So there's that conversation. That's the strategy conversation. But for us to go out into the field with the highly paid person's opinion about what the problem is, and to start building solutions based on the internal definition of the problem, this thing just wipes out thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of lost time, because it comes back and says, yeah, you know, that problem you're talking about is true. They have that problem. But there's this other problem that's really kind of interesting. Do we want to solve that problem? Did that sidestep the question, or did that address it?
Well, it was a great description. You did not get around to saying when do you have to have an engineer? When do you have to build the freaking thing and see it work?
Never. See, this is the other beautiful thing. So
I was worried you were going to say that.
Yeah. No, most of the results of these things end in agreement that this shouldn't be built. So again, Intel, another story from Intel. So they want to develop, this is years ago. Now we're sitting here in the reality, but years ago it was like, hey, we need this sort of teleconference system with video that allows our bench engineers to have experts available to them to talk them through a thorny problem. And they were going and investigating all sorts of, blue jeans and all sorts of technology stacks to make that happen. And I said, hey, can we just run a quick presumptive design workshop on this? And we had one of the teams take an Elmo, a stuffed Elmo, and take a cardboard frame and put it around Elmo and act out this future scene, sort of body stormed it with one of these target users. And the user said, I don't want that. And it wasn't that they didn't want to talk to Elmo. It wasn't because it was Elmo that they didn't want it. It was fundamentally not addressing the actual underlying concern they had, which may not actually have needed video to solve. But somebody in their requirements gathering early on heard it had to be a televideo conference thing. And once we started hearing what the real problems were, I turned to the VP and I said, look, I just saved you $100 million, right? So you often don't build these things because they clearly shine a light on bad ideas. The other thing I like to say to my engineering staff is, I can sketch a bad idea faster than you can code it. So give us the opportunity to get these bad ideas out there and test them without engagement with Clifton B. How nice to see you. Without actually having to build it, right?
Because you're in the first diamond, you're not in the second diamond.
Exactly. You're still trying to figure out what the friggin' problem is because you don't have confidence. Now, it's not fair, right? Because you got highly paid people who are telling you what the problem is. Home Depot, same deal. Executive Vice President of Sales tells me that we got this specific thing we've got to do. And I said, gosh, that sounds like a possibility for presumptive design. And one of the other beautiful things about presumptive design is you can say to those stakeholders, you tell me exactly who you want me to talk to. You got specific cherry-picked customers you want me to talk to? Great. Let me go talk to those folks. You tell me what the problem is. We'll sketch out what we think a putative artifact is that embodies that problem, and we'll go talk to those folks. And we did that. And within about 3 or 4 weeks, we came back with, that is not the problem at all. In fact, that isn't even close to the problem. There's this other really gnarly problem, which is like really bad, and we should solve that problem because it has to do with database, supply chain, complexity, craziness. And if we actually solve some portion of that problem, we can predict sales of 5x in certain markets. So we didn't stack the deck. We used the executive vice president's deck and came back with this data. So that's generally where it's most useful.
Clifton, talk to us.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Hey, Leo.
Hey, Clifton. And before you say anything, Clifton was on my team at Intel when we were doing a lot of these things. So go for it, Clifton.
That actually kind of messed up what I was going to say. I was going to say about 10 years ago, I had a sort of mentor who sort of, I had very much a mentor who really got me on this kick of user scenarios. And while you were giving your talk, I was almost 100% certain you were going to mention scenarios because I felt like they very much play a part in everything that you've been talking about. But I don't think you said the word once. And I'm kind of wondering, does that mean that scenarios are obsolete? Is there a new way of doing things? Should I be kind of refactoring my approach? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts on scenarios 10 years later?
That's great. So roll forward after we parted ways and I joined another enterprise, and I'll get to your answer through my usual roundabout way. My partner in crime at this new organization was the head of product, and I was on her hiring team. So I chose her to be this, from all the candidates, because she actually got UX. She actually understood how we could partner together. She and product, me and UX. It was really exciting. And about 3 months into the gig, and we have this great relationship, she turns to me and she says, I know what you guys do. I get it. I totally get it. But my team doesn't get it. And I can't seem to get them to understand what your team is doing. Can you give me a playbook? And she was a big sports person. I didn't know what she meant by a playbook. So I said, sure, we can do that. And so promptly 3.5 years later, we delivered a playbook. But the point is that in that playbook, we identified 80 different deliverables that UX could offer. And what we were trying to help our stakeholders understand is that we wanted them to come to us with the posture of, we're the Iron Chef. You are the restaurateur. You want us to design a restaurant experience, an eating experience, to meet certain requirements, performance specifications. What we don't want is for you to tell us whether to use the sous vide or the knife or the Vitamix or whatever we're going to use to build that meal. What we want to know is, do you want a picnic or do you want a 3-star Michelin tablecloth service? And then let us do our job. And so, to your point, one of those deliverables might be context scenarios. Another deliverable might be a presumptive design process. And the chef's choice depends on what the target ask is of our stakeholders. So the answer is, yeah, I got 6 scenarios in the process of being built right now, but it's a different tool for a different problem.
I want to acknowledge that we are very close to 9 o'clock, and I'm happy to stay on for a couple more minutes with anybody and have an informal conversation with Leo. But I also want to let people go who have done their duty and shown up for Bake-High on the second Tuesday of the month. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Leo, for making it possible for us to have this conversation. So don't leave if you don't want to, but I'll call this the end of the formal part of the program.
Yes, and I'm happy to stick around.
Thank you.
It was a delight to have you here.
Thanks, Rede. So I'm seeing a few familiar faces and some not so familiar. But anybody can speak up. So Leo, I'll do a nitpick for you.
Please.
As a linguist, the word ambiguous and the word vague have different meanings. And I think sometimes your artifacts are vague, right? Ambiguous meaning it has multiple meanings, and vague meaning you can't tell what it really means.
Yes,
so here's
both.
Right?
That's the shape, but that's the shape-shifting aspect, right?
Okay.
They can be both vague. Here's the deal. Let me deconstruct that for you, because I'll play table tennis with you on that one.
Okay.
You design them so they are vague. They are interpreted ambiguously.
Right. I'll go for that.
And that's the exciting part. And the hard part is how vague, back to Bill's earlier point. How vague. There is a and again, we talk about it in the book a little bit, but you cross a threshold of vagueness such to the point that they don't get it. Like it's just a blob. It just has there's no distinguishing characteristic that starts the conversation. So it has to be, in this weird liminal space, right? Somewhere between, meaning like it's telegraphing something, but
right. It's not
really
an
clear.
obvious single meaning.
Yep.
So, you've got to have enough specified so that there is the possibility of meaning being
Yes.
drawn from it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that the being human part is the part about tactile. You want to present them with something in the human scale that they can touch and move and play with, because that's how we are human and that's how we interact with things.
Yeah, it's really been interesting both in the pandemic, but also earlier on, attempting to do these artifacts digitally, right?
Yeah.
The level of specificity that digital actually asks of us is very difficult to overcome. Like I can take a marker and do a swipe on a whiteboard and ask somebody to tell me what that means. Yeah, tell me what that means, right? Really takes a practiced arm with a really nice illustration tool to get to that level of vagueness, right? And I mean, I can draw a straight line like you wouldn't believe, but all of a sudden it has more definition than I would like. And so we have to make things vaguer, right? And we have to fuzz them up
digital,
in order to in the digital world, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And as you and I have both been proponents of with the junk prototyping, and I know you're not a particular fan of googly eyes, but the point being, if I can take junk, and I have boxes of literally of junk in my basement, and I can bring them out to a site, and I ask people to do kindergarten collages with this junk, and it has something to do with meaning for them, it means something to them, that is so much more accessible for the creators on our stakeholder side. And it becomes so much more accessible to, with the right facilitation, so much more accessible to the participants and informants. They do often look at those and go, I don't know what to make of this.
Right.
And that's
I got taken away from my desk for 2 hours to do this stuff with you.
Right.
You've gotten that reaction, I'm sure. I had things to do. I had important things to do today. Right.
Yeah.
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 No, and here's my challenge for, I'm doing one of these prototyping things with a group tomorrow morning, and I had to send them out to do the scavenger hunt for materials individually, because usually it's me that supplies all the barrels of googly eyes and ribbon and stickies and stickers and look what I've got right here. Oh my God. Somebody like Sierra Club gave me all these wonderful
Oh my
things.
God, they're so perfect, aren't they?
Aren't they lovely? Yeah, all these
wolf noses. I see wolf noses in the future.
That's right. In the future, there are wolf noses. Anyway, so, but I didn't want to give too much instruction about what the materials should be that you would collect versus leaving it open-ended. And so I said, over the next week, collect the following kinds of things. And if you feel you must, go out and spend less than $10 at the dollar store, or go to find the stuff on the 4th of July sale. Well, they don't, not everybody has scrap, but go to the 4th of July sale or the Canada Day sales at the craft store and the grocery store and so on. And you'll find junk there that will be helpful to you to express yourself later. Right?
Yep. Yeah, that's a meta design problem.
Yeah.
That turns out to be a difficult design problem.
Well, I'm going to see whether my instructions, this is a test. Were my instructions at all interesting? Do we get any of can we make meaning out of it? Right?
Yep.
Anyway, I think
anybody else have anything to join me with?
I believe in wait time. Okay. Hearing no further questions, you know how to get a hold of Leo. leofrisch@acm.org works.
That's one way. Let me just put a few things in here.
Put some contacts in the chat, so if people want to follow up after they've had a chance to digest this. they can. I put a few of the references into the chat earlier. That's pronounced phase 2 design. Alrighty-o. And let us all say thank you to Leo for spending the evening with us at Bake High.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Appreciated the time.
And thanks everybody for showing up. We'll see you next month. And I can't tell you right at the moment what the program is going to be because it's Ted who's organizing it. I forgot to ask him ahead. But in September, we will have a former program chair from Bake High talk about his book. And that's Christian Crumlish talking about product management and UX and how those things feed one another. So I'm looking forward to that one too. Okay, see you in August.